80's Flashback. 4-star, 2-star, and a free map. In the 1980s, a petrol station wasn't just somewhere you stopped because the fuel gauge was hovering somewhere between optimistic and oh no. It was a destination. A pause in the journey. A place of ritual. You didn't simply refuel, you engaged. You checked your oil. You cleaned your windscreen with water that may or may not have last been changed during the miners' strike. You stood in a queue clutching a folded map, a Mars bar and possibly a packet of 10 Regal, while the cashier rang everything through on a till that sounded like a mechanical typewriter having an argument. Petrol stations in the 1980s had personalities. Some were glamorous. Some were terrifying. Some appeared to exist solely to test your patience, your clutch control, or your ability to reverse without taking out a concrete bollard. Let us now tour the great and the grim of Britain's 1980s petrol forecourts. Chapter 1, ESSO, the default backdrop to British life. If the 1980s were a film, ESSO stations were the establishing shots. Every town had one. Often two. Usually located on a roundabout that had been temporarily redesigned in 1974 and never touched again. ESSO stations were reassuringly consistent, white, blue, red, and faintly fluorescent, like they were permanently lit by a grey Tuesday afternoon. Why ESSO was memorable? The pumps were chunky, square and unapologetically industrial. The forecourt lighting made everything look slightly damp, even in August. The air always smelled faintly of petrol, rubber and disappointment. Inside, the shop, if there was one, sold road atlases that were already out of date. A rack of car care products nobody understood. Chocolate bars that had melted, re-solidified, and lost all structural integrity. ESSO was where you went because it was there. Not exciting. Not awful. Dependable. Like a Ford Sierra in beige. Chapter 2, Shell, the posh one, or so it thought. Shell petrol stations in the 1980s fancied themselves as aspirational. They were the ones that tried. Slightly better signage. Slightly cleaner toilets. Slightly more confidence in their branding. Shell didn't just sell petrol, it sold the idea of petrol. The Shell experience. Shell Super sounded genuinely superior. The logo suggested global sophistication. Some locations had flowers nearby, often plastic. Shell stations were also where you were most likely to find a forecourt attendant who actually looked like they enjoyed their job. Promotional mugs, glasses or collectible tat. The sense that someone, somewhere, had a marketing degree. If ESSO was a sensible cardigan, Shell was a blazer with elbow patches. Chapter 3, BP, the nation's favorite safe pair of shoes. BP stations in the 1980s were quiet achievers. Green and yellow, modest, dependable. They didn't shout. They hummed. What made BP stations stick? Often attached to slightly run-down garages. Forecourts that sloped in confusing ways. Pumps that worked, but never quickly. BP stations were places where the cashier knew half the customers by name. You might overhear a heated discussion about oil viscosity. Someone was always topping up water, incorrectly. They weren't glamorous, but they felt local. Community hubs, if your community revolved around unleaded confusion and tire pressure gauges that lied. Chapter 4, Texaco, the American cousin. Texaco stations stood out because they felt foreign. The branding was bold. The red star was assertive. The whole thing suggested cowboy confidence in a country still working out metrication. Texaco stations often felt like they were trying to be motorway services, even when they clearly weren't. Distinctive Texaco trays. Big signage. Slightly wider forecourts. An atmosphere of we mean business. Texaco was also where you might encounter American-themed promotions. Snacks you didn't fully trust. The sense that your car was being judged. Driving into a Texaco in a Metro or an Austin Maestro felt faintly cheeky, like turning up to a steakhouse with a cheese sandwich. Chapter 5, Total, the French interloper. Total petrol stations were rarer, which made them mysterious. Slightly European. Slightly different. Their branding felt sharper. Their stations were often smaller, tucked into corners of towns like specialist delicatessens of fuel. Why Total felt exotic. Red and white, very chic. Pumps that looked modern. A faint air of engineering confidence. Total stations often made you feel like your car would run better simply by association. You should probably check your tire pressures. You were doing something vaguely continental. Stopping at a Total station in 1988 felt like you were briefly holidaying in France without the inconvenience of a ferry. Chapter 6, The Rural Petrol Station, a Test of Faith. Every British driver of the 1980s remembers that rural petrol station. The one where the sign said open. The pumps looked abandoned. You weren't entirely sure anyone was inside. These stations were often attached to a village shop, a post office, someone's house. You rang a bell. Somewhere, a door opened. A person emerged who looked surprised you existed. Fuel was dispensed slowly. Very slowly. Payment was often taken in cash, sometimes in coins, occasionally with a story about the weather. These stations were terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Run out of fuel near one and it felt like salvation. Run out after passing one and it felt like fate. Chapter 7, Motorway Services, Petrol at a Premium. Motorway petrol stations in the 1980s were not places of joy. They were places of necessity. You didn't stop because you wanted to. You stopped because the needle was below E and you'd been ignoring it for 40 miles. Classic 80s motorway fuel station features. Higher prices, always noticed, never remembered. Pumps that seemed to require multiple attempts. Forecourts populated by exhausted families. Inside, you'd find plastic chairs bolted to the floor. Tea that tasted of regret. Toilets that encouraged very quick visits. Yet, there was something oddly comforting about them. You knew exactly what you were getting. Not good. Not terrible. Just, motorway. Chapter 8, Forecourt Technology, the Age of Buttons and Dials. Modern drivers will never know the joy of the 1980s pump. Big buttons. Chunky displays. Numbers that clunked into place with audible commitment. You pressed the grade. You lifted the nozzle. You hoped. Notable pump characteristics. Loud mechanical clicking. Displays that lagged behind reality. Occasional refusal to reset. When a pump malfunctioned, it wasn't subtle. It announced its displeasure loudly and publicly, often requiring staff intervention and a queue of sighing motorists. Chapter 9, The Shop, a Cabinet of Curiosities. The petrol station shop of the 1980s was a strange hybrid. It wasn't a convenience store as we know it now. It was more like a curated selection of things you might need, plus several things you definitely didn't. Classic stock included car mats in lurid colors, oil in metal tins, screen wash that smelled faintly toxic, keyrings shaped like tires. Food options were limited but memorable. Mars bars, Topic bars, wine gums that welded your teeth together. And always, always, a rack of maps. A few lonely magazines. Cigarettes behind the counter. Chapter 10, The Staff, Forecourt Philosophers. Petrol station staff in the 1980s were a breed apart. They had seen things, heard things, judged your car silently. They could change a wiper blade in seconds, explain octane ratings patiently, spot an empty tank from 50 yards. Some were cheerful, some were gruff, all were competent. They existed at the crossroads of humanity, petrol fumes and the national mood. Chapter 11, Why These Places Stay with Us. Petrol stations mattered because they were in between places. They were pauses, breathing spaces, moments where journeys slowed and life intruded. You argued over directions. You stretched your legs. You decided whether to push on or stop for a sandwich that would disappoint you. In the 1980s, petrol stations weren't polished retail environments. They were functional, flawed, human places. They smelled. They rattled. They worked. And somehow, that made them unforgettable. Conclusion: 4-star, 2-star, no stars, all perfect. Looking back, the petrol stations of the 1980s weren't perfect. They were messy, inconsistent, sometimes inconvenient. But they had soul. They reflected the Britain that used them, practical, slightly worn, occasionally cheerful, quietly getting on with things. Today's forecourts are brighter, faster, cleaner. But they're also a bit anonymous. The 1980s petrol station knew you. Or at least, it knew your car. And sometimes, that was enough. If you enjoyed this content and feel able to, please do like it or follow my blogs, Spotify and YouTube channels or Facebook channel. It would mean and help an awful lot. Thank you.